My guest today is Esteban Rossi-Hansberg. Esteban is a professor of economics at Princeton University. His research focuses on macroeconomics, the internal organization of firms and its impact on productivity, international trade, and urban and regional economics. Recently, he has been focusing on the geography of the pandemic and of climate change.
Hello, Esteban. Very, very excited to have a good friend on the show. We've been working for a long time, several things together, and you've continued doing extremely interesting work on many things, on international trade, on offshoring inequality, on the distribution of firms, on many other things.
Well, thanks, Luis, for having me. I mean, it's great to be with you. And, some of the interactions that we've had in the past have been some of the most intense intellectual activity I've had in my academic life. So I always remember them with a lot of great memories.
One question on why these local interactions that you're referring to matter so much. I mean, when we start thinking about the internet in the late 90s, we all thought that they would matter less and less. People would just basically work wherever they wanted and communicate across space. And yet what seems to have happened over the last few years, and then we'll talk about COVID, but pre-COVID has been that, in fact, it seems like these local interactions have mattered more and more. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I think, in some sense, because at the end of the day, there's just very large migration and trade costs. Effective. That is, when we think about these economies and we try to model these interactions, the reality is that the cost that we measure by looking at the activity of agents are very large still. Even though those technologies are there, even though we can trade with all the world, even though we can take a plane and go everywhere that we want, at the end of the day, we just don't do it that much on average. And so the question why is it? Well, because I think in practice, it is actually quite costly, right? It takes a lot of time to move. It takes a lot of time to find out about new places and interact with them. And yes, there are more interactions, but at the end of the day, across locations, but at the end of the day, those are still the minority of the interactions that we have. So I think what we have seen with these new technologies is that our interactions reach further, but not so much that those interactions along, large distances, etc., have really substituted for those local interactions. At the end of the day, we go to the local restaurant, buy in the local store, work in the local firms. And most of that, what that globalization has done, or what those new technologies have done, is that they brought those firms, those big firms, those global firms home. So now we have access to them. Now we have access to them in our little town. Now we have access to them in the internet, but still we're interacting with the local store. It's just that the local store happens to be a Walmart.
It's true, but I mean, it would seem like, I mean, there should be less of that with the internet. And what we have seemed to, I mean, all those things are constant. The store is still around, all the rest still around. And it seems like, okay, I add a technology that allows people to talk across space, and like now, that should make big cities, superstar cities, less important. And what we see is, for the last
yes
decades.
and no. Yeah, I mean, there's clearly an argument about that, and I think to some extent it has made the size distribution or the fortunes of some of the intermediate cities perhaps better as a result of access to some of these technologies. But if you think, for example, about the big cities, I mean, we've certainly seen a concentration in big cities. And part of that concentration has been the result of skill becoming more important and interactions between skilled people and the agglomeration forces and externalities that come out of those interactions becoming more relevant. And so that has definitely emphasized and segregated people, and those people have gone to the bigger cities partly because of amenities, but partly also because that's where they can earn the highest wages because that's where they can interact with others. And so those agglomeration effects, in some sense, are very large for individuals, particularly like the cognitive non-routine type of tasks that those individuals do. And the second aspect of that is that, I mean, we've seen in some sense firms move from technologies that had high variable cost and relatively low fixed cost to technologies that have very large fixed cost uh, but low variable cost. And to the extent that that's true, those fixed costs, where are those fixed costs produced? Where are the designs happening? Where are the distribution networks managed, etc.? All of that is happening in these big cities where this talent is. And so as we move those costs, we emphasize big cities, we emphasize increasing returns in those fixed cities and the externalities that those imply. And so in some sense, when we see globalization, yes, we can reach further, but at the same time, we are more intensive in skill and we are more intensive in fixed costs, both of which have a big urban bias. So I think that in some sense has led to more concentration in cities and has created like these global hubs of knowledge in some sense that are like, I don't know, the New Yorks, the Londons, etc. of the world, right? So that are, big hubs.
So let me ask you a little bit more speculative then. What is COVID, or the fact that COVID has pushed all these new technologies? Now we're doing much more Zooming, we're doing more interaction online. It's kind of accelerated a lot of these changes. What is your sense of whether is it going to kind of reduce these trends that you've been describing for the last couple of decades, or do you think that, look, these things, are here to stay, and okay, we have a little bump in the road, but big cities are the winners always, after all?
Right. Like, let me start by saying, like, highly speculative here, of course, but I mean, I think the evidence that we have in urban economics and all the studies of cities and systems of cities is that in general, systems of cities tend to be very resilient to shocks. So, cities are hit by shocks and they tend to come back, and the distribution of cities at the end of the day doesn't change that much as a result of those shocks, or doesn't seem to change as much as a result of the shocks. I mean, if you look at the evolution over time of the systems of cities in the United States, or in many countries in Europe, certainly in France, for example, it looks today very similar to what it looked 50 years ago. The distribution, of course, the overall size of some of the cities, etc., has changed, but the distribution itself, namely how much bigger is the biggest city than the second city and so on, is very similar, in fact, than what it used to be. And of course, today's economy is kind of different than the economies of the past. So cities have been very resilient to shocks. Now, the question is this time different or not? And I think there's a potential for it to be different, in particular because of these telecommuting type of technology. So we've obviously, these telecommuting technologies are not new. We've seen them, improve over time. And if you look at the data and you look at, say, before the whole COVID crisis or epidemic came, and you look at the telecommuting data, you see, an increase in the number of people that telecommute, but still at very low levels, right? I mean, we're talking 6%, 7% max, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. But rising, as you would expect from the technology getting a little bit better over time, or a lot better over time. So that's kind of the natural evolution of it. And so that's, of course, not going to change cities in a dramatic way. That kind of evolution of a little bit of a better technology is not going to change cities dramatically. Now, what happened with COVID is, of course, that we suddenly, we all went home, or a lot of us went home. And so what does that do in terms of, can that change the equilibrium? Can that change in a world in which there's multiple equilibria because, there's coordination effects on going to work versus not going to work? Does that mean that we change equilibrium? So let me be a little bit more explicit about that. Obviously, how much we get out of going to the office depends on who goes to the office, right? If we all go to the office and we all interact in the office, we get more out of the office. We learn from our coworkers. There's externalities that knowledge spillovers of what we talk about, how we interact, etc. in the office. That's why there's offices. And that's why, you know, if you want to rent an office in the middle of Palo Alto or in the middle of Manhattan, it costs you so much money because it kind of pays to be there. There's some benefits of being in those locations. Now, you know, so, but there's a big coordination component to that. If everyone goes to the office, it's great to go to the office, you get all these benefits and your employer gets all these benefits, the firm where you work gets all these benefits. But if no one goes to the office, it's not so good to go to the office because you have to commute, you have to pay all the commuting costs yourself, and then you go to the office and there's no one there, right? And so that's of course no good. And so so that's like a classic coordination problem. I want to go to the office if everyone goes. If no one goes, I don't want to go to the office. And so what did COVID do, or in particular the lockdowns associated with COVID do? Well, they send us home, right? So now we're all home, and so the question is, well, suppose now we lift everything and the vaccine comes and we're all in, and the whole pandemic goes away. And now are we going to go back to the office? Well, if we're coordinated in the equilibrium not to go to the office, right? That's an equilibrium. We're going to stay there, right? And no, we're just going to stay at home and not go to the office. Why? Because I don't want to be the first mover and go to the office because I don't get anything out of going to the office if no one goes. So it's classic coordination problem. And the question is, you know, can we solve that coordination problem and make everyone go to the office as, you know, we had before the crisis? And I think it's, you know, it's not going to be that easy to do because there's of course kind of individual advantages of staying at home and telecommuting. Most people are saving, an hour on average, not having to go to work and back. And that hour is valuable. You stay with your family, etc. Of course, there's heterogeneity in the preference of going to the office or not. So there's all sorts of issues there. But the question is, if not going to the office is in fact an equilibrium, we might very well stay there, and in a way that unless firms and governments are proactive in moving us back to an equilibrium where we all go to the office, we're going to stay there. Now the question is, well, is that bad? Is there a problem? Well, maybe that's a great equilibrium. That's the modern world. We should all stay in the office and telecommute. Maybe that's great. But all the evidence that we have is that those interactions are valuable, and that if the economy, doesn't get all those interactions, and to the extent that telecommuting doesn't exploit all those interactions and doesn't encourage those interactions, or at least the resulting interactions become less valuable, then the economy is going to suffer and productivity is going to suffer in the long run. So, and certainly cities are going to de-agglomerate as a result of that. So I think we still don't know. We still don't know if we're going to move to that other equilibrium, but most likely there's going to be some policy and some push from firms and potentially governments to bring people out of their homes again.
But what you're saying is that some of these are external, not just to the worker, but even to the firms. There are externalities that maybe the firm doesn't capture. The firm is saving itself some money by not paying the rents, but the city and the productivity of the whole economy could suffer, right? That's part of what you're afraid of.
It can happen at different levels, right? So as you correctly said, I mean, it can happen at the firm level where, I have an incentive to go or not to the office. The firm internalizes this and therefore can give me an incentive and say, look, we as a firm are more productive. If everyone comes to the office, I'm going to give a bonus for coming to the office and, share some of the rents that I would get out of the firm being more productive if everyone goes to the office. And that may be enough to incentivize workers to go to the office. And But then there's another level at which, there's interactions across firms. And if everyone goes to the office, those interactions are going to be richer, are going to lead to more spillovers, etc. And there we would need the city government to act, or, the overall government to act. And so I think this is full. I mean, all these interactions are very rich. It's very hard to internalize all of them. And we were, in some sense, in a good equilibrium where we were paying a lot of commuting cost. So that's true too, right? I mean, we were paying a lot of commuting costs. The car was super important. Everyone was going to the office and driving to the office, and that has all sorts of costs. And there's externalities there too, etc. But at that cost, we were getting a big benefit, which was all these productivity enhancements from all of us being there. And now we might switch. And so I think it's a quantitative question to what extent the benefits from not commuting and all the potentially also environmental benefits of having less people driving, etc., are going to compensate for the productivity losses that we're going to see from people not going to the office.
So this morning, just to emphasize your coordination point, somebody was telling me, I was asking her, oh, you must be happy because you're in Barcelona, so you don't need to be going to Madrid for all these meetings. And she told me, well, it was fine to be working from Barcelona when everybody in Madrid was at home. Now, when all the people in Madrid are in the meeting in Madrid, I am missing all the pre-meeting, post-meeting, all the gossip, the elevator, the chat. And for me, it's a disaster to continue from Barcelona. So as Esteban said, as you said, basically it's only when everybody else is there that you really want to be there, and vice versa. And that was very sharply put. It's an experiment all people watching us can make
and
themselves.
It's very hard to, with these technologies, as good as they are and as much as they help us, it's very hard to substitute for those side conversations that you pointed to. I mean, there are a lot of interactions, there are new relationships, there are all of these things, I mean, that others of course have noted before, that are still missing with the current level of technology. Now, of course, if we're in the equilibrium where we don't go to the office, that may also encourage, bias technological change that, towards improving those interactions online. And that may, develop those technologies faster. I mean, that of course is a possibility, but it's something that still we don't know, and we don't know how good it will be overall. Most likely, there's going to be some loss in productivity as a result of us not going to the office.
And here, your bottom line is you would encourage public policy directed trying to get people back.
I think so. I mean, I think we need to evaluate it better in terms of, what are the costs, what are the benefits from the different options. But the reality is that the economies throughout history were in the equilibrium where we were obtaining those gains from agglomerating in the workplace, and those traditionally seem to have been large and have been measured to be large in a number of studies. And so, giving that up seems very costly. Again, there's other benefits from not commuting, but losing those benefits seems overall something that policymakers should be worried about.
So let's take another form of geography, which is trade. Here, you've been thinking about how globalization interacts with the pandemic. Most of us would have thought, like, look, and that's, I think, the standard idea on the street, that look, if you have a globalized economy, it's more likely that things spread rapidly because of contagion. Travel encourages contagion. You've said in this work you've been doing, you said not so fast. There are other aspects from trade. Why don't you explain us this interaction?
Right. So, I mean, globalization and pandemics in some sense are naturally linked, and the link is that in order to trade, in order to interact across countries, we need human interaction, some level of human interaction. And to the extent that, that human interaction leads to contagion, the, globalization is going to tend to create that international contagion. And as a result of that, is globalization seems to affect pandemics in the sense of increasing the likelihood of those pandemics. And in the COVID case, we're full of stories of particular international conference in Boston on biotech that leads to spreading to all sorts of states. And in history we see the Black Death and spreading through commerce, etc. So that link is fairly well established. Now the question, it seems kind of almost like a necessary theorem of a theory that if you have more of those interactions, that should lead to a higher probability of pandemics. Now, what we point out is that the reason we say, well, not so fast, is that when you actually model that and you think about countries that in principle can be very different, right? And where the, contagion and probabilities, etc., could be different because they have different health systems, because they have different distributions of economic activity, because they have different types of population in terms of their age distribution, all sorts of differences across countries. Once you start thinking about countries that are very different from each other, that can lead to different types of outcomes. And the reason is that, well, we interact, at the end of the day, we have a number of interactions in our daily routines and in our daily kind of or monthly purchases of goods. And if we're traveling, well, we're not interacting at the local level. And so, in some sense, the way to think about it is, at the end of the day, what matters for your contagion is the totality of your interactions. And globalization implies that less of those interactions are local. And so if you have a disease environment that is particularly bad at the local level, having more interactions, having a more globalized, if you will, set of interactions, disperses those interactions across a disease environment that on average is better than the one at your local level. And in those cases, then globalization can help because it diffuses, in some sense, the risk of contagion across the population rather than concentrating it in one particular environment where everyone is just interacting within that environment. And so that can, of course, happen across countries, but you can also think about it as happening, across neighborhoods, right? So if you are only in your own neighborhood and your neighborhood, everyone is getting sick, right? Then of course the chances that you're going to get sick are much larger than if you kind of are all day in different parts of the city because you just interact less with the people in your neighborhood, right? And so at the end of the day, this kind of dilutes the spread of the disease. And in these models, that's very important to whether you get an overall big increase in the number of infections or not. And so that type of effects of essentially globalization diluting interactions because you have a bigger pool and you mix good environments with less good environments is important in determining whether you're going to have a pandemic or not.
And I guess it gets too technical, but I'm just thinking it in my head. I mean, if you think of those models, those susceptible, infected, recovered models, the typical models where right. All these epidemiologists work on, and which is the one you rely on in this paper. It seems like if you have separate boxes, then yes, this box is going to get sick, but then the other box will never have any. But if you have kind of movements between boxes, at the end of the day, eventually, both boxes are going to be full of people infected just through seeding a new box and starting it again. What is the factor that goes, how does that mechanical expansion get slowed down? I mean, I don't know if it can be explained without getting too technical, but.
Well, I mean, I think the key to the point is not just about getting infected or not. You're absolutely right that at the end of the day, is the reproduction, rate of the worst environment that is going to matter for whether you have a pandemic in the whole system or not. So in that sense, you're absolutely right, right? So it's like in some sense, but the extent of the pandemic, how important the pandemic is or not, matters too, right? How extreme is the pandemic? And so you can have like a very small pandemic where, some people get sick, but at the end of the day, not that many people get sick. And the whole, hump is very flat and the total amount of people that get sick is small. Or you can have a super extreme pandemic, right? So, and that depends, of course, on how large is this reproduction number, right? And so you can think about it as well, yes, if one country has a bad disease environment and, that's going to lead to a global pandemic in the sense that both countries are going to go to a curve of infections, right? But because it's so diluted, the overall reproduction number for the whole system is going to be very close to one, is going to be small, right? And so that's going to lead to a very small pandemic, right? It's going to be very small, slow moving, but also where the total number of people that ultimately get sick is much lower than if you have a very high reproduction rate where both countries, that reproduction is very high in both countries. You don't get dilution. And as a result of that, you get a big curve in both countries. And so, yes, you're going to have a pandemic. That's going to depend on what's the country that has the worst environment. That's going to dominate whether the whole system has a pandemic or not. True. But how big that pandemic is depends heavily on the level of that R, and that depends on, whether one country has in itself an R that is much lower than one, and the other country has one that is very high. So the average is actually kind of very close to one, and that can actually help the whole system.
Okay, I understand it now. And this is something you have thought about, and also you and I in the past. What we have seen is that the size distribution of firms has been getting really, really concentrated. There is many fewer, very much larger firms that dominate markets like Amazon, like Google, like Netflix,
Definitely.
like many other fields. And many people have been concerned about these being result of anti-competitive practices, people taking aggressive anti-competitive measures, kind of increasing margins, increasing monopoly power. But as you're pointing out, there's many other effects that similar to the effects that lead to cities becoming also larger, that could be driving the firm size distribution. If I push you to say what is the main fact that suggests, that allows you to discriminate between these two theories, market power, kind of abuse of dominant position on the part of maybe somebody like Amazon, versus technological change, what would be the main factor that you would point out as differentiating those things?
Right. I mean, I think one key aspect is that in the sectors where we've seen those large firms grow, we see increasing employment. We don't see those sectors. So if I group industries or I order industries by the degree of concentration that we've seen, or the increases in concentration that we've seen over, say, the last 3 decades or 4 decades, right? The sectors where we see the highest increases in concentration are sectors that have been growing in terms of employment. Now, of course, there's other reasons why those sectors may be growing in terms of employment. It's not only what's happening in terms of the industrial composition of the sector, but right, there's no real evidence that that there's this phenomenon by which there's a few firms that are making the sector small by constraining how big the whole sector is, right? Because we see exactly the opposite. Those sectors have been growing. And so for me, that is a big red flag in terms of thinking about monopoly power restricting the growth of a particular sector. And on the other hand, it's very much consistent with improvements in technology being the main source of the expansion. And so the way I think about this is improvements in technology that are making these firms change the way they operate. And part of that change makes them bigger because it's technologies that are more based on these fixed costs, like we were saying before. And part of that may be, the improvement in span of control and the type of things that we've talked about in our work. But the other point that I wanted to make that is very important and is kind of related to this is, like you said, I mean, we've seen these big increases in concentration. Of course, that has raised lots of alarms about market power, etc. And there's many studies that have argued that market power of these firms has been increasing. But there's a counterpart to that, which is one of the points that I was making before, which is the way a lot of these firms have expanded. And the internet companies are a little bit of a different case. But if we look at the rest of the economy, the way they've expanded is by replicating geographically. And in these local markets, we don't see increases in concentration. These firms don't have a bigger share of those local markets. They have a smaller share than the biggest firm in those markets used to have. So a bigger way of thinking about the economy, I think, for many sectors, not necessarily all sectors, and certainly not the internet firms, or the high-tech firms, but for many, many sectors in the economy, the lion's share of sectors in terms of employment, what the right way to think about it is there was a local monopolist, right? There was a local monopolist, and here comes a chain that is growing and is entering all these markets. And of course, nationally, they are grabbing a big chunk of the market. But at the end of the day, even though their national share is very large, their local share, right, the local share of the biggest firm has been falling because now they're competing with the local firm. Right.
So in fact, it's actually increasing rather than reducing competition in the relevant sense.
Well, I mean, at least we see it in concentration. Now, if you want to talk about, I mean, of course, then we will come and say, well, that's not competition. And of course, concentration is not competition. We all understand that, or it doesn't have to be, let's put it like that. But the reality is that there used to be one guy there selling, hardware, and now there's three. Why? Because there's that guy plus two chains that are selling hardware in that little town. And so what does that imply for prices? We still don't know. We haven't, because it's very hard to do those markups at the local level. So we really don't know what the local effect is in terms of markups. But the fact that we see more of them in and lower concentration in those local markets as a result, it's a fact. So in some sense, the way these firms have expanded, the nature of that expansion limits, the way they can exploit their size, because at the end of the day, they are competing in all these local fragmented markets. And so that's another way to think about geography and the kind of the importance of geography that we started with, right? Thinking about the actual context in which these firms are competing, which is not the national level. In most cases is to some extent a local level or a regional level.
So let me finish going back indeed to geography with a fascinating paper that you put up. I mean, I'm amazed that you could do this just recently, yesterday, in fact, about the impact of climate change on the organization, on the geographic distribution of economic activity planet-wide. I mean, it's really an amazing piece of simulation and of work. Tell us a little bit, first, how you do it, because it's really amazing that can be done. And then second, what do you find?
Right. So we were talking about like the way where I think about spatial economics, etc. And if there's one topic where thinking about the distribution of economic activity, the frictions of the distribution that determine the spatial frictions that determine the distribution of economic activities is the effects of climate and global warming in particular. And the reason is because at the end of the day, if you want to assess the impact of, say, temperature rises over the next 100 years, 200 years, what we need are frameworks in which agents are making decisions about, how to react to this phenomena, where firms and individuals understand that, they have options to living in a world in which, temperatures are much larger, or where their house is going to be flooded, or etc. The reality is that if you live in an area where your house is going to be flooded, you can move away, right? Now, that's costly. It's not simple to move away, as we've talked, before, but you can do it. And so we need to model that. We need to think about those options and how is that new world going to look like, right? And so that new world is going to make where climate change affects local productivities, makes people move to different locations, make people produce locally in different sectors that are less or more subject to temperatures, makes people invest in different parts of the world, etc. And so what we want to model kind of those adaptation mechanisms. And in the paper that you're mentioning in particular, the key force that we want to kind of model and think about is to what extent locations are going to change their specialization between, let's say, in particular, between agriculture and non-agriculture as a result of this, and whether that's an effective adaptation mechanism for them or not, right? So if you are in sub-Saharan Africa, temperatures are rising, and now your share of employment in agriculture is relatively large compared to other parts of the world, and now temperatures are rising, which affects agriculture in particular. What can you do? Well, one option, of course, is to say, well, let's stop producing agriculture and let's do some manufacturing, right? Now, of course, what's the obvious objection to that is, well, first of all, they're just not that good at producing and manufacturing, right? And so that's an issue. And of course, the other is that, well, you still need food. And so you're going to have to trade with others in order to get the food that you need, because obviously we all want to eat and need to eat, right? And so the key is to kind of model those trade-offs and try to think about whether a specialization and sectoral specialization is an effective adaptation mechanism to climate change. And what's the role that trade and trade costs plays in facilitating that type of adaptation or not. And what we find is that, in fact, climate change, in particular global warming, is going to change the regional specialization of the world quite dramatically. So the particular areas in which agriculture is going to be, in 100 years, are going to change from move north quite a bit. And the particular regional context in where they will be, they're going to be much more in Asia rather than in, say, South America or northern United States as a result of this movement. And so other areas are going to specialize more in manufacturing. We see also how population is going to move. And so we're going to see, exodus of populations away from Africa, away from parts of Latin America, away from parts of Australia as a result of this. So the idea is to try to track those things and then, evaluate what the consequences of this will be once you introduce a credible adaptation mechanism in terms of specialization, etc. How do you do it? Well, and I'll finish with this. The goal is to create the same way we had a revolution in economics about trying to think how to microfound aggregate models, right? By modeling the behavior of individual agents, the preferences of these individual agents and their decisions, the profit maximization of firms and the decisions of firms. We want to introduce an intermediate level where these agents, you don't go from these agents to aggregate models. We go from these agents to put these agents in a particular location in space, right? And that's kind of like the micro foundations of this intermediate form of organization, if you will. And so once you do that, that intermediate layer matters, and you can model it. You can model these interactions, and we have now the tools to do it. And of course, big computers have helped us there too, but we have the tools to do it, and we have and so we can really quantify these models, set up these models, and then quantify them at a very detailed level, right? Where we can use a lot of local data to try to inform these models in terms of the local characteristics of, or the characteristics of these local economies in terms of their productivity, their amenities, the local trade costs, etc. And so that is, that we now have these models. We're starting to make these models also dynamic. And so once you have like these spatial models, kind of high resolution spatial models that are dynamic, where people can move, they can trade, and they can invest, you're in business. Then you can evaluate climate change. And so that's I think the project. The project is use these models as climate assessment models and bring kind of modern economics to that
It's very, very, very impressive. I mean, there's one thing that I can't resist asking you, which is one that you discussed before on cities, which is the coordination cost. You were saying, look, the coordination cost, the moving cost, two related things, which is, first of all, people seem to really want to stick together, right? So for one individual to move north just because the weather is worse, I mean, it's hard. He wants probably to move his entire family. And that requires this coordination, but also it requires taking into account how sticky he is to his place. How can you, if you can summarize it in a minute, because otherwise we go too long, but how do you get to this question?
I mean, that's a tricky point, and I'm not sure that, the models that we have so far kind of deal with it in the, the way it deserves. I agree that these moves are coordinated moves. And but the way these models work essentially is you have effects of a shock, say climate, right? And that implies changes in productivity that are directly from climate, but also because they change the location of individuals by changing that productivity, they also change the investment that firms do at the local level. And so there's like a gradual process by which whatever change you have impacts market size, and through market size firm investments. And so that makes, that creates an evolution of the distribution of economic activity, in particular people, away from certain areas and into others, and allows these individuals to develop those new areas in which they go, where they go. And so in that sense, there's no actual coordination, but there is something that looks like coordination in the sense that if we all move to Siberia, right, eventually, not immediately, but eventually, we'll make Siberia a nice place to live, in the sense that we'll invest there and we'll all be there and we'll be creating cities there, etc. And so that's gonna create an agglomeration in those places. And so the fact that we introduce agglomeration effects into these places creates kind of these non-linearities that essentially look like coordination and work like coordination.
So I guess our viewers can use your paper to decide which plots of land in Siberia to buy, where the activity will move.
Just don't come to me with
complaining. In 100 years, don't worry.
I don't want to insure anyone about, for those investments.
Thank you very much, Esteban. It was really wonderful to talk to you.
This is a pleasure always to talk to you.